Hello, brave hearts, and welcome back to Girls Who Rise, a place for stories, for courage, and for discovering that some dreams are worth working hard for. Today, we're returning to Anne of Green Gables, where Anne begins one of the biggest adventures of her life. Let me ask you, have you ever reached a dream only to discover it was really the beginning of a brand new adventure? Sometimes we spend so much time hoping for something that we forget the real journey begins after we get there. Every new beginning brings new things to learn, new people to meet, and new challenges we never expected. As we continue Anne's story today, we'll discover that courage isn't always about doing one brave thing. Sometimes courage is simply showing up each day, doing your best, learning from mistakes, and believing that your hard work matters, even when you can't yet see the results. So, before we begin, find a comfortable spot. Let your hands rest quietly. Let's take a deep breath in and a gentle breath out. Notice your breathing just as it is. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. This is your time to imagine, to wonder, and to grow. Before we return to our story, here's a story note. Anne of Green Gables was written over 100 years ago and has been gently abridged for listening. Abridged means a few parts have been shortened or made a little easier to follow, but all the important moments and the heart of Anne's story are still here. So, get cozy, settle in, and let's return to our story, where friendships are growing, challenges are waiting, and Anne Shirley is about to discover that the sweetest victories are often the ones we work hardest to earn. Now, let's begin. Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. Chapter 36. A Queen's Girl. For so long, Queen's Academy had seemed like a distant dream. It shimmered before Anne's imagination like a far-off city, beautiful because it was still safely out of reach. But now the dream had become real. A packed trunk, carefully folded dresses, school books, goodbyes, and a train that would not wait simply because a girl's heart was full. The morning of Anne's departure dawned bright and clear. Green Gables looked peaceful beneath the early light. The orchard stood quiet, the kitchen smelled of breakfast and Marilla's careful order, and everything seemed exactly as it always had. Somehow, that made leaving even harder. Anne came downstairs dressed for the journey, her eyes shining with excitement and tenderness all at once. She had promised herself she would not cry. She wanted to leave bravely, like a girl ready for the next step in life. But when she saw Matthew standing by the door in his best coat, looking as proud and sorrowful as any man could look, her courage wavered. "Well now," Matthew said, clearing his throat, "I suppose our girl is off to Queen's." Our girl. Once she had belonged to no one in particular. Now she belonged at Green Gables. Marilla was wrapping a small parcel for food for the journey, though Anne had already insisted she would not need it. "You'll eat this when you get hungry," Marilla said. "Don't lose your ticket. Keep your money pinned inside your pocket. Write as soon as you're settled. Don't sit up half the night talking. And remember, you're there to study, not to let your imagination run away with you." Anne smiled, though her lips trembled. "I'll remember everything, Marilla. At least I'll try. But if my imagination runs away with me a little, I hope it runs in useful directions." "I don't know that imagination is ever as useful as plain common sense," Marilla replied. Her voice, however, held none of its usual sharpness. She fussed with the parcel string one last time before placing it firmly in Anne's hands. Diana came to say goodbye and to walk to the train station. The girls walked slowly down the lane together, not because there was anything left to say, but because leaving without one last walk seemed impossible. "I shall miss you dreadfully," Diana said. "And I shall miss you," Anne replied. "But we'll write, Diana. Long letters. And when I come home for the holidays, we'll have so much to tell each other that one afternoon won't nearly be enough. It won't be the same without you, Diana whispered. Anne squeezed her hand. No, she said softly, but we'll have holidays together and the letters besides. Think how delightful it will be to have so much to tell each other. We'll never run out of things to say. At the station, there were more goodbyes, more reminders, and a flutter of feelings Anne could hardly name. Matthew lifted her trunk into the baggage car, though someone else would have gladly done it for him. Then he brushed an imaginary speck of dust from Anne's sleeve before stepping back, uncertain of what ought to come next. Study hard, he said. I'll take good care of myself, Matthew. He nodded. We're proud of you, Anne. Nothing more needed to be said. When the train finally pulled away, Anne leaned toward the window until the familiar faces became smaller and smaller. Matthew raised his hand in a quiet farewell. Marilla stood very straight beside him, while Diana continued waving long after Anne could scarcely make out her face. The train gathered speed, carrying Anne farther from the only home she had ever truly known. She remained at the window as the countryside slipped by. Familiar fields stretched beneath the autumn sky. Soon the lake of shining waters sparkled into view, peaceful as ever. Beyond it lay the white way of delight, where so many happy afternoons had disappeared beneath the whispering branches. She wondered how many ordinary moments she had hurried through without realizing that they would one day become precious memories. Green Gables itself had long since disappeared from sight. Yet she carried it with her all the same. Anne settled back in her seat and turned her eyes toward the landscape ahead. Behind her was the life that had shaped her. Before her, Queen's Academy was waiting. Charlottetown seemed wonderfully large to Anne. Shopkeepers greeted customers from open doorways, and everywhere she looked, there was something new to discover. After the quiet roads of Avonlea, the city felt exciting, though just a little bit overwhelming, too. Anne had arranged to stay in a boarding house. The landlady welcomed her kindly and showed her to a small but cheerful room with a bright window and enough space for her treasured books. Anne decided that that was enough to make it feel like home for a little while. Among the other young women staying at the boarding house was a student named Priscilla Grant, who had come to Queens from another part of Prince Edward Island. She had calm gray eyes, a thoughtful manner, and an easy smile that immediately put Anne at ease. The girls were introduced over supper and soon discovered a shared love of books and lively conversation. Before the evening was over, Anne found herself laughing more than she had expected on her very first night away from Green Gables. I'm so glad we met, Anne said as they climbed the stairs together. Everything has seemed so new today. I was beginning to feel rather like a boat that had drifted out into a great wide sea. Priscilla smiled. I'm glad we've met too. It's much nicer not to begin somewhere new all by yourself. Anne thought she was probably right. As she settled into bed that evening, the room no longer felt quite so unfamiliar. Green Gables was many miles away, and she missed it already. But perhaps new places become less lonely one friend at a time. The next morning, with her books tucked neatly under her arm, Anne set out for her first day at Queen's Academy. The grand brick building stood before her, filled with students from every corner of Prince Edward Island, each carrying hopes of becoming a teacher. The entrance hall buzzed with voices as students hurried from one classroom to another. Anne had never seen so many young people gathered together with the same purpose. She was simply another student among many. That thought was both unsettling and strangely exciting. Anne found her classroom and slipped quietly into a seat near the middle of the room. Around her, students introduced themselves and spoke eagerly about the year ahead. Some seemed perfectly at ease. Others looked every bit as nervous as Anne felt. Before long, the instructor entered, and conversation ceased at once. There were no lengthy welcomes. Lessons began immediately. As the morning passed, Anne filled page after page with careful notes. The teachers expected their students to think quickly and work independently. Assignments came one after another with very little explanation. It was very different from Avonlea. By the end of the first day, Anne's head was spinning. For the first time, Anne understood that nearly every student at Queen's had been one of the brightest pupils in his or her own school. Success here would have to be earned. As she left the classroom, Anne noticed Gilbert Blythe walking a short distance ahead. He turned, saw her, and offered a friendly nod. "How did you find your first day?" he asked. "Rather like climbing a mountain and discovering another one waiting at the top." Gilbert laughed. "I was beginning to think I was the only one who felt that way." For a few moments they walked together, talking about assignments and teachers instead of old misunderstandings. Anne found herself surprised at how natural the conversation felt. Once she could scarcely bear the sight of Gilbert Blythe. Now they were simply classmates with the same goal. When they reached Anne's boarding house, their paths separated. She watched him disappear into the crowd. That evening, the dining room buzzed with conversations as students compared assignments and laughed over the surprises of the day. Anne listened more than she spoke, content to simply become acquainted with the people around her. Later, she and Priscilla spread their books across the table in the sitting room. The hours slipped quietly by beneath the warm glow of the lamp. When Anne finally climbed the stairs to bed, she was pleasantly tired. Already she understood that success at Queen's would require more than intelligence. It would require discipline, perseverance, and the willingness to keep trying, even when the lessons seemed difficult. Oddly enough, that thought did not discourage her. It filled her with determination. Chapter 37. A Winter of Learning. Autumn slipped quietly into winter, and before Anne realized how quickly the weeks had passed, life at a Queen's Academy settled into a comfortable rhythm. Each morning the halls were filled with eager students carrying armfuls of books, determined to make the most of the year. Lessons began promptly, assignments piled up quickly, and evenings were devoted almost entirely to study. After supper, the students gathered around the tables in the boarding house with books spread out before them, while the lamps glowed warmly against the early winter darkness. Priscilla quickly became one of Anne's dearest friends. Her calm, cheerful nature balanced Anne's enthusiasm perfectly. They encouraged one another through difficult lessons, shared long evenings of studying, and spent their free time exploring Charlottetown together whenever their lessons allowed. As the weather turned colder, Anne found herself missing Green Gables in unexpected ways. It was often the smallest things she longed for the most: the quiet stillness after sunset, the creak of the stairs, and the comforting feeling of being home. Letters from Green Gables soon became treasures. Marilla wrote practical letters filled with news about neighbors, church events, the weather, and the everyday happenings at home. Matthew usually added only a few words at the bottom. "We are all well. Study hard. We are proud of you." Diana's letters were entirely different. She filled page after page with stories from Avonlea, asking questions only Anne could answer. Anne replied just as faithfully, telling her about Queen's Academy, her teachers, Priscilla, and everything she was discovering in Charlottetown. The letters made the distance between them seem much, much smaller. As Christmas approached, the academy closed for a short holiday, and Anne returned to Green Gables. The train seemed to move much too slowly for Anne's liking on the return. She pictured Green Gables wrapped in snow, the kitchen warm with the smell of baking, Matthew waiting patiently at the station, and Marilla pretending she had not been counting the days until Anne came home. Nothing delighted her more than seeing Matthew standing on the platform when the train finally pulled in. The moment he caught sight of Anne, his whole face brightened. "Well, now," he said, taking her suitcase, "it's good to have our girl home again." "It's good to be home," Anne replied, slipping her arm through his as they started toward Green Gables. The familiar road to Green Gables had never looked more beautiful. Fresh snow covered the fields, trees sparkled beneath their icy branches, and the farmhouse stood warm and welcoming beneath a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Marilla was waiting at the door. "You've had a long trip," she said, taking Anne's coat before giving her an appraising look. "You're thinner than when you left. We'll have to see if we can't fix that before you go back." Anne smiled. "I've missed you too, Marilla." The house felt exactly as Anne remembered it. That evening, after supper, Anne settled into her old place by the fire. She happily chatted about Queen's Academy, the endless studying, the teachers who expected so much of their students, and the new friends she had made. Matthew listened with quiet pride, asking an occasional question, but mostly content to simply hear Anne's cheerful voice filling the room once again. Marilla sewed by the lamp, pretending not to listen, though every now and then she looked up with a thoughtful smile whenever Anne became especially animated. That holiday passed quickly. Anne visited Diana, and the two friends found that they had enough stories to fill far more than a single afternoon. They laughed over old memories, shared everything that had happened since autumn, and walked together through the snowy woods where every familiar path welcomed them back. One afternoon, Anne wandered to the orchard, now sleeping beneath its blanket of snow, and stood looking across the fields. Everything appeared just as she remembered it. Yet, while Green Gables had changed very little, Anne had. She had left as a girl dreaming about Queen's Academy. She returned with new friends, new responsibilities, and a growing confidence she had not possessed before. Before anyone was quite ready, the Christmas holiday came to an end. Soon it was time to pack and leave once more. Leaving was still difficult, but this time it no longer felt as though she were leaving one life behind for another. Green Gables would always be home, and she would carry it with her wherever she went. As the train pulled away once again, Anne watched Matthew, Marilla, and the familiar farmhouse grow smaller in the distance. She knew she would miss them. When Anne arrived back in Charlottetown, Queen's Academy no longer seemed unfamiliar. Among the other students, none worked more faithfully than Gilbert Blythe. Anne often noticed his name near the top of the marks posted by the instructors, usually very close to her own. There was no longer any bitterness between them. Instead, each quietly encouraged the other to work just a little harder. Neither would have admitted it out loud, but each respected the other's determination. As winter deepened, lessons became even more demanding. The instructors reminded students again and again that the final examinations were drawing near. Those examinations would determine not only their standing at Queen's, but also many of the opportunities waiting beyond it. One afternoon, Anne received an essay that had been marked a little more critically than she expected. The instructor's comments were fair, but they stung all the same. By evening, however, she had read the comments again, made careful notes, and resolved to do better next time. There were moments of discouragement, of course. Sometimes Anne felt she would never remember another historical date or solve another mathematical problem. Other times she wondered whether she had prepared herself well enough. Whenever those doubts crept into her thoughts, she remembered why she had come. She wanted to become a teacher. She wanted to continue learning. And she wanted to make Matthew and Marilla proud. Those reasons carried her forward whenever the work seemed too great. One snowy evening, Anne closed her books at last and looked around the quiet room. Priscilla was still studying nearby, and several other students remained bent over their lessons. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently beneath the glow of the streetlights. There was something comforting about knowing that they were all working toward the same goal. No one expected success to come easily. The examinations were drawing closer with every passing day. She felt nervous, certainly, but she also felt ready. Chapter 38. Chapter 38. The Glory in the Dream. At last, the day the students had been preparing for all year arrived. Anne awoke before dawn, certain that she had forgotten everything she had ever learned. Downstairs, the breakfast table was unusually quiet. The cheerful conversations that normally filled the room had been replaced by a thoughtful silence. Books rested beside nearly every plate, and more than one student stole a last glance at a page before hurrying out the door. Anne reached for one of her books. Priscilla smiled. "You know there isn't time to learn an entire year's lessons before breakfast." Anne looked down at the open page for a moment before closing the book. "You're right," she said. "If it isn't in my head by now, it isn't likely to get there in the next 5 minutes." The examinations carried special importance for every student. Those who earned the highest marks would graduate with first-class honors. But there was another honor everyone quietly hoped for as well. The student who finished first in the examinations would receive the Avery Scholarship, an award that would help pay for a year of study at Redmond College. Anne had dreamed of attending Redmond ever since she first learned it might be possible. Still, she tried not to think about it too much. When Anne entered the classroom, she noticed that even the most confident students looked unusually serious. The instructors greeted the class kindly but wasted no time. As the first papers were distributed, Anne offered one silent prayer that she would remember what she had worked so hard to learn. The hours passed more quickly than she expected. Some answers to questions came almost at once, while others required careful thought. More than once she paused, closed her eyes for a moment, and waited patiently until the answer returned to her. When the examination ended, Anne laid down her pen with a quiet sigh of relief. One examination was behind her, but several more remained: history, English, grammar, geography, mathematics. By the end of the week, Anne felt as though she had poured every lesson she had ever learned onto those examination papers. "I don't believe I could answer another question if someone offered me a fortune," she said as she and Priscilla walked home after the final examination. Priscilla replied, "I don't believe I can even remember my own name." For the first time in many months, the evenings belonged to the students again. There were no lessons to prepare, no essays waiting to be finished, and no dates left to memorize. At last the day arrived when the results would be announced. Long before classes were scheduled to begin, students gathered in the academy halls. Some tried to appear calm by chatting about ordinary things. Even those who smiled seemed unable to hide their nervousness. Anne and Priscilla found seats together. "My heart is beating so loudly," Anne whispered, "that I feel certain everyone in the room must hear it." Priscilla answered with seriousness, "If they do, they won't notice. Their own hearts are making just as much noise." At that moment, the instructor carrying the list of names entered. The room became perfectly still. One by one, the names of the students who had earned first-class honors were read. Anne scarcely dared to breathe. Then she heard it. Anne Shirley. A wave of relief washed over her. She had done it. A moment later, another familiar name was announced: Gilbert Blythe. Anne glanced across the room as Gilbert's name was read. He gave the slightest nod to himself, quietly satisfied with a job well done. Their old rivalry had carried them both farther than either of them might have gone alone. When the room had settled, the instructor lifted another paper. "There is one final announcement. The Avery Scholarship, awarded each year to the student who had finished first in the examinations, will go to Anne Shirley." A warm burst of applause filled the room. Priscilla reached over and squeezed Anne's hand. "I knew you could do it," she whispered, her eyes shining. Anne smiled through her happy tears. "I hardly let myself think about it," she admitted. "Everyone works so hard. I only hoped I had done my very best." Students gathered around to congratulate Anne. Among them was Gilbert Blythe. "I hoped you would win," he said, offering his hand. "No one worked harder than you." Anne smiled as she shook it. "Thank you, Gilbert. And congratulations to you as well. First-class honors is something to be very proud of." "I think we've both earned a good rest," he replied with a grin. There was no rivalry between them, only the quiet respect that had grown between two students who had challenged one another to do their very best. Several days later, when Anne returned to Green Gables for the summer, Matthew was waiting at the station just as he always had. The moment he saw her, his face brightened. "Our girl has done it," he said, his voice filled with happiness. Anne smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you and Marilla." "Nonsense," Marilla said as they walked toward the house. "You earned every bit of it yourself." That evening after supper, Anne read aloud the letter explaining the scholarship and what it would mean. Redmond College felt wonderfully close. Matthew listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he looked at her for a long moment. "I've always known you could do it." Marilla reached across the table and gave her hand a gentle pat. "You've worked hard for it," she said. As the three of them sat together in the peaceful comfort of Green Gables, Anne looked around the familiar room. She realized that sharing her happiness with the people who had loved her and believed in her all along made the day even more wonderful. Later that evening, Anne thought about the long months at Queen's Academy, the difficult lessons, the late nights, the moments when she wondered if she was good enough, and the friendships that had carried her through. Winning the Avery Scholarship filled her with joy, but it was only part of what made the day so special. Sharing that happiness with Marilla and Matthew made the achievement feel complete. Anne smiled as she turned back to the welcoming lights of Green Gables. Tonight, there was nothing left to prove. Tonight, there was only gratitude. And this is where we'll pause for today, Bravehearts. Before we leave Anne for now, let's spend a quiet moment thinking back on where her journey took her in these chapters. She said goodbye to Green Gables and everyone she loved. She stepped into Queen's Academy, where she quickly discovered that she was surrounded by students who worked just as hard and dreamed just as big as she did. She spent long evenings studying, worked through moments of discouragement, and kept going even when she wondered if she was good enough. Then, after months of perseverance, Anne earned first-class honors and the Avery Scholarship. But one of the sweetest moments wasn't receiving the scholarship at all. It was coming home and sharing that happy news with Marilla and Matthew, the two people who had believed in her from the very beginning. As you think back on today's story, notice which moments stayed with you the most. Stories often help us notice feelings that we've experienced, too. Sometimes we understand our own hearts a little better after watching someone else grow through something difficult. So, let's name those big feelings we heard today, because when feelings have names, they don't feel quite so confusing anymore. Perseverance, self-doubt, and accomplishment. Perseverance is choosing to keep going even when something feels difficult or takes a long time. It doesn't mean you never get discouraged. It means you don't give up. Anne shows perseverance every time she opens another book, studies one more lesson, or decides to try again after making a mistake. Have you ever wanted to quit something because it felt too hard? Maybe you were practicing a musical instrument, learning a new sport, or working on a school project that seemed to take forever. Can you remember how it felt when you kept going anyway? Self-doubt. Self-doubt is that quiet little voice inside that wonders, am I good enough? Almost everyone feels that way sometimes. Anne wonders if she belongs at Queen's Academy because suddenly she's surrounded by students who are just as bright as she is. Have you ever went to summer camp where everyone already knew each other? Shared something you created, a story, a drawing, a song? Did you wonder if you would fit in? Did you wonder if you were good enough? Feeling unsure doesn't mean you can't do something. Sometimes it simply means you're learning and growing. Accomplishment. Accomplishment is the happy feeling that comes after you've worked hard toward a goal. It isn't about being better than someone else. It's about looking back and realizing how much you've learned and grown. Can you remember a time when you finished something that made you feel proud? Maybe you hiked to the top of a hill and looked back at how far you came. Maybe you stood up for someone who needed a friend. Or maybe you learned something you once thought you'd never understand. How did it feel to look back and think, I did it? Anne didn't become confident overnight. She became confident one choice, one mistake, one friendship, and one lesson at a time. The same is true for all of us. Growth doesn't happen all at once, it happens little by little. So today I wonder, what is something that feels hard right now that might not feel so hard a year from today? And if you could encourage the person you'll be a year from now, what would you tell them today? You don't have to answer those questions right away. Sometimes simply noticing is enough. We also see these feelings in the people around Anne. Matthew never stopped believing in her, even when he said very little. His quiet encouragement reminded Anne that someone was always cheering her on. Marilla showed love in a different way. She reminded Anne that her success came from hard work, and she wanted Anne to know she had truly earned it. And Gilbert continued to encourage Anne by simply doing his own best. Sometimes the people who help us grow aren't the ones who give us advice. Sometimes they inspire us just by working hard beside us. Thank you for being here today on Girls Who Rise. As we wind down, let's take one slow breath in and a gentle breath out. Remember, you don't have to be the best to belong. You don't have to know everything to begin. Believe in yourself even while you're still learning. And never forget that your story is still being written. You matter. Until next time, be gentle with your heart. Keep noticing your thoughts and feelings. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Girls Who Rise. so you don't miss our final episode of Anne of Green Gables. Until next time, brave hearts, see you soon.